All right, so we're going to start off now with the first of our lectures here on evolution. And so this first chapter that we're going to look at is on microevolution. So basically the approach we're going to take with the evolution section of this course is to cover microevolution first, and then we're going to go ahead and do a chapter on macroevolution. So first thing we need to think about then is what the difference is between micro and macroevolution. Microevolution refers to changes that occur within the gene pool of a single species. All right, so we're going to talk a lot about that in this chapter, whereas macroevolution is going to deal with changes that occur above the species level that typically result in the production of new species, new genera, new families, new orders, new classes, and so on. So they're bigger level, bigger scale changes that start off with microevolutionary sorts of processes, but eventually lead to the production of brand new species. So we're looking at these two chapters in this course. Microevolution, which is this chapter currently, the one we're doing right now. And then the next chapter that we'll do is macroevolution. All right, so we are not going to go into a huge amount of detail on Darwin's life, his background, his story, all that kind of stuff. It's a pretty fascinating thing. If you ever get a chance to read some books on sort of his life, biography of his life, those kinds of things, it's actually a worthwhile read because it gives you some context into a lot of the other ideas that were going on both during his time but also before his time in terms of what led to his thinking and how he came up with the ideas that he did. So one of the things that Darwin saw when he was on his voyage around the world, so you may be familiar with the voyage of the Beagle, those kinds of things, but one of the ultimate things he saw and thought about with his trip around the world was the genetic variation that is in nature. And so what Darwin saw was that populations of species, no matter what they were, whether they were plants or animals or otherwise, populations of species in nature were not the same. Right? So people didn't understand genetics yet, so he wouldn't have used the word genetically homogeneous or the term genetically homogeneous, but that's essentially what he was getting at, is that populations always have variation within them. No population is exactly the same within every individual in that population. And so what eventually kind of arose from that line of thinking was that, well, because all these different species contain individuals and populations that are different from each other, those differences might actually be kind of like the raw material for natural selection. It's these differences among individuals that produce the ability for natural selection to occur. And so we've talked about natural selection in this course. We're going to talk about it, of course, a lot more now. But natural selection is the idea that individuals in a population that have the best traits for that environment are the ones that are going to do the best, they're going to survive longest, they're going to leave behind more offspring, and the next generations are going to look more like those successful individuals. The individuals that have the less viable traits are those that are not going to do as well, they're not going to survive as long, they won't reproduce as much, and so therefore their particular genes are not going to show up more in the next generation. All right, so there's a little bit more to the idea than just saying survival of the fittest, but that's essentially what we're dealing with here. Now, evolution then is the result of the process of natural selection. Natural selection, most of the time, is the raw material that drives the evolutionary process. Okay, so as these species change over time, depending on which individuals have the best traits, which traits are the ones that are going to be the ones that become the most common, that will then drive the evolutionary process. So we then need to think about also, okay, well, what is evolution, right? We've talked about that before as well, but evolution is the change in gene frequencies in a population, a change in a gene pool over time. So if we see a type of fruit fly that has some particular trait that happens to help it succeed in its environment, then that new trait in these fruit flies will become more common, and that is evolution, right? It's an increase in the abundance or the proportion of the traits that do the best in the population. So evolution is a change in a gene pool in a species over time. Now, although Darwin was credited with the idea of evolution and natural selection, and I've mentioned this before earlier in the course, he did not invent the idea of evolution by any stretch of the imagination. This idea had been around since Aristotle, who was around 2,000 years before Darwin was ever born. Lots of people talked about species changing over time. But what Darwin did, and a couple of others at the time, was Darwin came up with a way to explain the mechanism of evolution. So in other words, how it actually takes place. Not just that it exists, but how it happens. And that was really the big jump forward when it came to evolutionary thinking. Right? So again, the thing that really gave Darwin the I guess the unique status of being credited with the idea of evolution was the fact that he came up with a mechanism for it. Before Darwin's time, there were all kinds of crazy ideas about how a species might change over time. And they were completely ridiculous, right? So we'll talk about Lamarckian evolution here in a second, which was really the second best explanation, which is not great. But there were lots of other ideas that tried to explain how evolution worked. Evolution was a fairly well-established idea. It's just that nobody really fully understood how it worked until Darwin and another guy by the name of Wallace came along and kind of gave the description of what they thought natural selection was. So, for example, Lamarckian evolution was kind of the most widely accepted principle about how people thought evolution worked before Darwin's time. So Lamarck said that species change over time because of things that happen to them in their environment, and they then pass those changed traits on to their offspring. All right, so the classic example of Lamarckian evolution would look like this. We've got these giraffes. They always use giraffes in this example. So we have this giraffe, which, over the course of its life has to spend its days reaching up into the treetops to get leaves to eat. Over time, it stretches its neck more and more and more and more, so by the time it's ready to reproduce, its neck has actually gotten longer than it was when it was born. So this very sort of short-necked, stubby-necked giraffe becomes more, elongated-necked, and eventually when it reproduces, it passes on that longer neck to its offspring. Which, on the surface might sound okay, but if you sort of think about this in a different way, think about what would happen if someone dyed their hair green, right? If someone dyes their hair green, that's the result of an environmental change. Lamarckian evolution would say then that all of that individual's offspring would also have green hair when they were born. Okay, well, what happens if the first two offspring, and that's not ridiculous enough, right? So what happens if the first two offspring have green hair, and then mom changes her mind and dyes her hair purple? Well, after that point, every other individual is going to have purple hair that's born to that mother. So clearly, this is not how evolution works. If you lose an arm in an accident, heaven forbid, your kids are not going to be born missing that same arm. If you go to the gym every day for 6 hours a day for your entire life and you get ripped, your kids aren't necessarily going to be born ripped. That's an environmental change that does not get passed on to your descendants. So Lamarckian evolution was an idea that really logically didn't work at all, but it was the next best idea, and it was actually the one that most people believed was how evolution actually worked. So what Darwin would have said then was not so much the idea of change happening in the environment and that change being passed on to the offspring, but Darwin said that, okay, we've got a population of giraffes. And these different giraffes have different length necks, and this trait is somehow able to be passed on to the offspring. So if we, have short-necked giraffes, they produce short-necked giraffe calves, which is hard to say. I like to think of it as being like girafflets, but I don't really think that's what they're called. Long-necked giraffes would then produce long-necked girafflets, right? So that's the idea here, is if a parent has a trait, it somehow passes that trait onto its offspring, and that's how this inheritance sort of works. So if you have the longest-necked giraffes that do the best, get the most energy from these really, really high treetops, and leave behind the most offspring, well, in the next generation, the average neck length should be just a little bit longer because the longer neck giraffes did the best. And the shorter ones that had the inability to reach into the treetops are leaving behind fewer offspring, so that trait will then become less common in the population. So that's the basic idea of natural selection driving Darwinian evolution. All right, so like I said at the beginning of this lecture, microevolution essentially is the study of population genetics and looking at how certain traits that are coded for by certain alleles become more common or less common in a population. In other words, how evolution works. So we are looking at evolution through initially small changes in a population, genetic changes in a population, that over time can create much larger scale changes. The key to this, though, is having that genetic variation. You got to have that difference in the population, which means that some individuals survive and reproduce, while other ones don't, and that's kind of the material that drives the evolutionary process. So you might wonder, okay, well, how do we get a sense for how genetically diverse a population is? And of course, we can't go in and look at every single allele of every single individual in every single population. So what population geneticists do is they try to find like a stand-in or a proxy way to estimate how diverse a population is genetically. So, for example, population geneticists might choose to look at how many different polymorphic loci there are in a population. All right, so first thing, we got to figure out what the heck that term means. Remember, a locus is a position on a chromosome where genes are found, and loci is just plural for locus. So, a population geneticist, for example, might go in and look at how many loci in a genome have multiple different alleles. And so, you don't really have to look at every single individual of the population to get a sense for that. You just get like a subsample, and you look at, okay, well, we've got these 3 different loci. And for this first one, there's like 5 different alleles. And for the second one, there's like 3 alleles. And for the last one, there's like 8 alleles. That's a fairly diverse population for that particular set of loci. In a different population, maybe for the first one, you've only got 2 alleles. And for the second and third, you've only got 1 allele. So that would be a relatively, non-diverse population in that case. So that's a quick stand-in way to get a good estimate or an overview of what diversity might look like in a population. Another way to get a sense for genetic diversity is to look at the degree of heterozygosity in a population. And so we've covered that before now. We know heterozygous is a condition that occurs when an individual inherits 2 different alleles from its 2 different parents. So dad gives a big A and mom gives a little a. That produces a heterozygous condition in the offspring. The more heterozygosity you have in a population, the more diverse that population is. Okay, that's kind of the idea there as well, without having to go in again and look at every single allele for every single gene that every single individual has in a population. All right, so this brings us to the big picture topic in this chapter, the microevolution chapter. And that big picture topic is what we're going to look at in the rest of this entire chapter. And that idea is that of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Okay, so you're going to hear me use that term a lot in this chapter. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is an idea that occurs when a population does not change over time. Remember, equilibrium is long-term stability. We've talked about that before with homeostasis and so forth. Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is a condition that occurs when a population is not changing. If it stays the same genetically, we say it's in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Well, in this model, in order for a population to be in equilibrium, there are 5 conditions that have to be met. There's 5 boxes that you have to check if a species is going to be considered to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So the first one is that a population in equilibrium cannot experience any mutations. Because if you think about it, if a mutation pops up for a certain gene, automatically that changes the gene frequencies of that particular gene in that population. So for example, if you've got a population where 80% of the individuals are carrying the big A and 20% of the individuals are carrying the little a, what happens if all of a sudden a third allele pops up? What happens if there's a little a prime mutation that happens? Well, because we now have a brand new allele in the population, that by definition has to change the percentages of big A and little a to make room for that A prime. So mutations then will throw a population out of equilibrium. The second assumption that has to be true for a population that's in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is that there cannot be any what's called gene flow. Gene flow is when you have genes or alleles, especially alleles, being transferred between populations. So if you have migration of a bunch of individuals in a population and they carry a different set of alleles than the original residents, then that population's gene pool is going to change because the immigrants are carrying a new set of alleles. That would be something else that would throw a population out of equilibrium. For a population to be in equilibrium, there has to be truly random mating, which means that every male in the population has an absolutely equal probability of mating with every female and vice versa. If that does not occur, if there's any sort of selective mating in a population of any kind, and we're going to talk about all these points as we go through the rest of this chapter, if there's any non-random mating, that again will throw a population out of equilibrium. Our fourth assumption here is that the population size has to be big, and therefore, because the population is big, the effects of something called genetic drift are going to be minimal. All right, so genetic drift refers to random changes that occur in a population's gene pool over time. Not changes that occur because some alleles are beneficial and other alleles are harmful, but changes that occur randomly over time in a population's gene pool. Now, in a really small gene pool, those random changes can actually have some really big effects. But in a really, really big gene pool, those random changes, proportionally speaking, are going to be a much lesser effect, and therefore they're not going to change the population as much as in a small population. All right, now the fifth assumption that has to be met for a population to be in equilibrium is that there cannot be any natural selection. Because natural selection, after all, is the process that drives the change in gene pool of a population. In other words, evolution. Natural selection normally drives evolution. So if you have natural selection, then you know the population's not in equilibrium because you know the gene pool frequencies are changing, right? So the question then is, okay, how likely is it for a population to have all 5 of these boxes checked, all 5 of these conditions true, and therefore be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? And the answer is, it's absolutely downright impossible for all 5 of these assumptions to be met all the time. Right? The mutations, they're not common, but they happen. There is going to be gene flow. There's going to be migration from one population to the next. There's going to be some non-random mating where individuals choose mates preferentially, if nothing else based on proximity or distance. You're more likely to mate with, if you're an ant species, you're more likely to mate with ants that are right around you than those ants that are 20 miles away from you, right? So the population sizes are not always big, and of course natural selection almost always occurs. So we basically have built this model of equilibrium that we just said is impossible to have. So why do we bother talking about it? Well, the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium model is essentially a control model. So that if you see a population whose gene pools are actually, gene frequencies in the gene pool are actually changing, which is all the time, population gene pools are always changing, these are basically the 5 usual suspects that will cause a population to change over time. So if you see a population changing, and populations always change, you basically now have 5 different options for the culprit that's causing that population to change over time. It's either going to be mutation, gene flow, that's better, non-random mating, genetic drift in a small population, or 95% of the time or more, it's going to be natural selection causing a population to evolve. All right, so again, the Hardy-Weinberg model is a control model that assumes that all 5 assumptions are met and therefore that a population is not evolving. If a population is evolving, which is most of the time, then these are the 5 so-called agents of evolutionary change that cause that population to change its gene frequencies over time. Okay, so that is a concept which is a little bit hard. You got to kind of like work around that and think about it, kind of mull it over, let it ferment in your head a little bit, and it'll start to make sense. But if it doesn't, of course, you can always ask, could you clarify that? Could you help me with that? Because it is kind of like a big topic to kind of wrap your mind around. All right, so at this point, we're going to cut off this section because we're about out of time. And when we come back with our second section in the Microevolution chapter, we will start looking at the mathematics of Hardy-Weinberg and then start looking at some more detail about those 5 agents of evolutionary change that we just talked about on that previous slide.